Again, continuation of session 7, and we're talking about working the system and citizen involvement in the government. And one of the concerns that I would like to just transfer, we had a really excellent presentation just last session on John Adams, and it's important for us to recognize when we think about our founding fathers, it's really helpful when we consider where they came from. Almost every founding father had some form of just ordinary and more non-substantial as far as background, as far as coming from higher up governors or princes or kings or what have you. They were the ordinary people who, by their Christian background and their education, pursued God in a practical fashion. Now, practically, when we finish this particular class, my concern is that I would like us to leave here with a sense of vision and practical strategy and maybe even some motivation to have our own involvement in government be enlightened and substantive. And so what I'd like to do is turn a little bit of a corner and just going to recite a little bit of the nature of how we participate, and then maybe give some examples and share a little bit of my own testimony. So hopefully you won't leave without a sense of your own potential for participation. First of all, when you look at the formation of the government, in our last lecture we'll talk about some of the simplicities of the Constitution, but what is essentially at the core of citizen involvement in government is the assumption that the citizen has interests that need to be considered in the course of maintaining government. So that's the first fundamental issue. The citizen has some form of interest, and so what the nature of the American system is intended to provide is to provide the means by which the citizen can manage and can have their interests preserved and, if necessary, educated when the time arises, when the time is needed. Now, at the foundation of this structure then is the primary understanding that the citizen has interests. And so if you have a citizen that has interests, there's the natural instinctive assumption that those interests are not only valid, but that they deserve to be provided for. But if you can just imagine, if you have two citizens claiming competing interests, then all of a sudden you have the very essence and understanding of what government is all about, because two citizens competing for the identical interest, which would cause one set of interests to be abridged on behalf of the other citizen, that's the very nature and essence of government, of law, and of how we apply law in a matter of justice, bringing justice to bear between two competing interests. So that's the fundamental foundation, and we'll spend a little bit more talk about that in the session, next session. But when you look at the American system, then I'd just like to briefly address what it is and how you may go about asserting your rights in a responsible fashion when your interests are at risk. So in the big picture, we have the structure of the federal government, and we have the structure of the state government, and then we have the structure of the local government. And in the structures of government, you have really in every case the three forms, the three branches of government, always there in some fashion. You always have the administrative branch. The administrative branch is always responsible in some fashion for carrying out the laws and rules and regulations of its jurisdiction. So usually when you have a concern that is being competed against by government, then the administrative branch of that government is likely to be the opponent, the competitor with your interests. And so, obviously, in the case of citizens' rights versus government's rights, the government has a lot more substantial capacity to be bullied. I mean, to not be bullied, but to bully, to use force and threats to accomplish what it believes it wants. And a citizen that's negatively motivated by a fear of being bullied will very often fail to participate or give any kind of consideration to what might be valid rights, because they're just surely afraid of the power of the authority. And so what we find here then at the very foundation of this whole sense of participation, if you don't understand what your rights are, and if you don't know how to go about asserting those rights in a proper lawful fashion, then those rights, though you have them, though you possess them, those rights may very well be utilized. You yourself may set aside and fail to use them. One of the number one problems with loss of rights in any society has to do with the abrogation of those rights. The word abrogation means the abandonment. You stop using your rights, you stop asserting your rights, and you fail to use those rights long enough, and the government imposes rights over you long enough, then at some future time you no longer have those rights because you've never maintained them in any substantive fashion. Let me illustrate real quickly. When the railroads were built, government took sweeping authority over land ownership, and they basically, for the sake of building the railroad and the commerce of the people of the nation, they declared wherever the most suitable paths for a railroad exists, we will claim that land and utilize it for that purpose of the railroad. Now, in the legislation authorizing the use of railroads for that purpose, there was clear limiting powers. Now, at this point I'm speaking of Maryland. Maryland was where we live, but Maryland law basically said the railroads are for the purpose described, the seizing of land. If at any time the railroads cease to use this property in the fashion so prescribed, that land reverts without any act of the General Assembly or any court or any application by the prior landowner. That land simply reverts back to the original landowner. So that was obviously, when you're trying to seize people's property, it's nice to have a statement in there that if I no longer need it, I'll give it back to you. But that was the nature of the law. I happened to sit in one of the sessions of the Maryland General Assembly, listening to, I believe, third reader bills getting ready to pass, final passage in the House, and was astonished to hear that a new law had been written. The new law was seizing all the abandoned railroad property, was seizing that property for the use of creating an oil pipeline to transfer oil across the state. There also was other seizings of railroad property for parks and bike trails and what have you. In the discussion on the floor, one delegate asked the question, well, did anybody talk to any of the landowners? I mean, here's what the law says. This railroad property has reverted back to original owners. It is no longer our property, and we would have to gain some genuine access to it. But not one property owner was even aware that the property had been returned to them. Not one property owner raised a question or a concern. And so by abrogation, by a failure to assert rights and privileges granted to an individual, there was the loss of those rights. And so the state simply took the railroad property for other uses for the state, which it considered legitimate. So that is at the fundamental foundation of why the citizen needs to be active in maintaining and asserting the use of his rights and privileges. Now, that's the essence of this discussion. What does it take for a citizen to find their way into the system and to participate? Well, the first thing that a citizen needs to do is understand what the law actually is. And the citizen needs to understand what the law actually is, obviously from an accurate standpoint, and he needs to use that law in a fashion that's acceptable and appropriate. He also needs to be ready to stand up and deny inappropriate extensions of authority over him. Now, let me illustrate it. Since we're homeschool students, we have a common heritage with the homeschool laws of the state of Maryland. And so I'd like to just give a little bit of background, a little bit of history. When the Walkersville program began years ago in 1983, when it was formed, I formed the program out of a general knowledge of what the rules and regulations and the laws of Maryland provided for. It was the law of Maryland that allowed churches to operate and to establish educational programs. That was the term in the code. And an educational program was exempt from state governance if a church operated it. So if you have two schools being started, if one school is being started by a church and that church claims the legitimate authority to operate that school without interference by the state has no authority whatsoever to step in and interfere and prevent that school from operating. On the other hand, if you aren't a church, you're just a citizen, and you decide, I'd like to have a nice private school in our area for citizens, the law clearly states that you may not operate your private school in your area without expressly receiving approval from what the legislature established. The legislature creates the laws. They establish that there is a body of government, the Department of Education. That body of government had the authority to oversee and approve your educational program before you could receive students. Now, there's also another segment of the law, 7-301, that mandates that children attend public schools. That's the law. You must attend a public school. Now, they have an exception to children attending public school, and that exception is this: to receive regular thorough instruction in the same subjects. So there's a Proposition 2-206 that allows churches to offer educational programs free from state intervention. And there's a proposition in 7-301 that simply says a student either is enrolled in a public school or receives regular thorough instruction. Now, that is the essence of the basic law, but there has been, as it were, sort of an unwritten understanding. And the unwritten understanding is regular thorough instruction implies a private school. Doesn't say it anywhere, it's not anywhere required, it's not the nature of the law, but that's the way the general practice occurred. When I started the Walkersville homeschool program, I recognized that the state allowed regular thorough instruction. I also realized that the state allowed churches to operate educational programs. And so I blended the two from 2-206 and 7-301. I blended the two concepts together and came up with what I believed was a lawful interpretation of how a student can be homeschooled without the governmental interference of the state. So we established our program based on that review, based on that understanding of the law. Well, 2-206 says nothing about what makes a student a student. 2-206 simply describes what makes an educational institution an educational institution. And an educational institution offers an educational program. That's the essence of it. And so the offering of the educational program establishes the institution, and by general logic, there's an implication that the student would participate in the educational program that's being offered. I mean, there's the assumption, there's the inference of the student being present in that environment. However, in 7-301, there's not a requirement that a student is involved in a private school. There's just over time, the assumption that that participating in a public school satisfies the law, or some other form of regular thorough instruction satisfies the law, and the spectrum was wide open. Well, back when the law was established, public schools and private schools were not the only forms of education. Homeschool was a very common manner of education. And so basically, in the original form of education in Maryland, homeschooling was going on all the time, and if you were homeschooling your kids, then you were keeping the law. That was the way the law was written. But what happened is, in time, parents stopped using the home education liberty, and eventually it became assumed that that was no longer valid. When I was establishing the program, I had a lawyer who was with some experience, even at the national constitutional level. He said to me, "Your legal argument is impeccable, but you need to understand something about the nature of a court. Because no one in Maryland for 100 years has bothered to homeschool their kids, that the interpretation of regular thorough instruction is no longer common or expected or considered in the ordinary flow of life. And so today, a judge is not likely to look at the law and say, it meant what you're doing. A judge is likely to say, well, nobody's doing it, so it couldn't have meant that. So you're coming up with a creative new alternative." So when that attorney made some recommendation for how to participate lawfully and do what the law says without getting yourself in a legal bind that you can't really defend, his suggestion was, well, you need to make yourself as completely apparent as a school as possible, so that you can make a broader defense. Don't just hang your defense on one particular thing. So as we went forward with the program, that's actually what happened. We organized the Walkersville program like schools are organized. We have curriculums that are required. We have students completing work in a required fashion. We have validation of student progress in a required process. We created these particular structures, and thus we set forth our program. Well, it was my opinion that the program was lawful, but when the State Board of Education found out about it, it was their opinion that it wasn't. Now, what you have here is probably the nutshell of why it's so important for you and I to be alert to our liberties and to use them in the broadest capacity as possible, or we'll fail to use them. We'll lose them. We'll fail to keep them. So when I made my presentation to the State Board, basically, this is what they said to me. Now, this was a private conversation, so I really couldn't prove it in a court of law, but this is what they told me. They said, listen, here's the problem. We don't know how to deal with you. And if we grant you certain kinds of rights and privileges based upon how you presented your program to us, we're really not worried about you. That's probably going to be suitable for us. Obviously, you've done a good job at organizing your program. However, what we're thinking about is, well, what if somebody wants to copy you and have the same rights, but what if they don't do it as well as you did it? What if they don't have the same consideration? And so what they were basically saying is, I was appealing to the law that said the Board of Education had no right to rule over church educational programs, and they were acknowledging, you're right, we don't have a right, and we don't really have a problem, you really do have an educational program, but we're not really willing to acknowledge your program lest other churches declare, well, they want to have the same right over their educational program, and they want to assert that right. And so there was, right there, competing interests. Here's the interest of the state. The interest of the state seemed legitimate to them. You know, what if 1,000 careless creatures artificially created meaningless homeschool programs just so that their kids could be kept out of school under pretentious reasons, and these poor kids wouldn't get an education, and all of these concerns that they had were in focus. The reality was that was their concern, so they felt like they had the right to abridge clearly stated liberties because of their interest to ensure that children receive an education. So that's what I mean when I say there's always competing interests between two sets of liberties, and that's the nature of participation in government. You're going to find competition for your liberties. Your obligation is to enter the arena and state well what your liberties are and how your liberties can and indeed should be accommodated, and to be considerate in the process of also granting and considering the liberties that, or the duties that perhaps exist perhaps with the state. Now, what happened to our program, I sat down literally and I thought, well, if you're a legitimate educational program and the state recognizes you as such, what do they recognize? What do they recognize as legitimate? And so they actually have a rule, they have a COMAR rule for defining what private schools do to be considered legitimate, how they actually go about approving legitimate schools. And I said, well, the state must be limited to those interests. No matter what else they want to do, they must be limited to those interests. And so when I organized the school program, I recognized that on the libertarian side, I had total liberty to do whatever I wanted. But I really didn't ever have liberty in the mind of the original legislature. I didn't have liberty to say pretentiously, I'm going to have a school, but and actually fail to provide a school. So that there was a sense of understanding the nature of competing interests that went into the foundation of the school program. I acknowledged that a school ought to do things that schools do. If we're going to be an educational program, if we're going to quote unquote offer an educational program, there ought to be some common features to educational programs that would in the one sense put us in liability of being called or being accused as an educational institution, and on the other hand provide the expression of legitimacy that we were actually doing something that we said we were doing. Now, in the course of competition, I was this little tiny mouse ready to be squashed by this big giant elephant. That was how I felt. I remember the interview that they made with me, which they laughed. They said, well, how many people are in your church? Well, they wanted to establish whether we're a church or not. How many people are in your church? Well, at that time, we had 3 families in our church beside ours. Well, that's not a very big church. They pulled out a folder and said, I want you to see, here's 6 files of families that quote unquote created churches. The father's the pastor, the mother's the principal of the school, and all they're doing is homeschooling. Well, I happen to know of these families, and none of them were Christian either. And there was no church about their family at all. It was just a lawyer's attempt to take a legitimate area of law and use it as a loophole, and to pretend that we're having something to get around a regulation. So I was kind of smiled at and said, well, you know, you're not much bigger than this little church, you know. You kind of are small. And of course I think they thought easy to squash because you're small. And then they asked me, well, how many students are in your school? I said, well, besides my own children, we have 1 student. Because our first enrolled family was from Hagerstown, and they had 1 student. So we were a small church and a small school. And the state had this large sense of their interest. They had 6 cases that they believed to be fraudulent churches that wanted to be considered churches exclusively for the purpose of escaping the Board of Education's review of their educational program. And so, that being their just interest that they considered, then they looked at our situation, and by the time I presented our material to them, I had a 54-page manual that was carefully drawn up. They were a little astonished because, though we were small, there was clear evidence that we were legitimate. So here we are in competition. Now, I just want to say a couple things about this whole big picture of citizen involvement. Because when you're fighting the state and you're a parent with children that could potentially be considered at risk, there's an unstated threat that the state can step into your world and declare you an unfit parent and take your kids from you. That's the threat of force of the law, okay? Well, in that context, I don't think I want to lose my kids. It's very easy to back down from legitimate engagement in the process of participation by pursuing justice to resolve issues with the government. It's very easy to back down. And so here's my little lecture, my little preaching at you sermon. If you are pursuing that which is right in God's eyes, then you have the premise of justice on your side. And if you will pursue what's right in God's eyes, if you will pursue justice in any arena of government, then there usually will be some means of securing those rights in some form of agreement or rewriting of a rule under a court ruling, whatever. There's some mechanism for redressing your concerns, and you want to, as much as possible, give consideration. Well, if this is what I need to do before God, then it's what I need to pursue. I went through a little process. In fact, when your parents enrolled in our program, part of the enrollment process includes a little review of how we view ourselves legislatively, legally with the state, and what have you. And I have these little 10 steps to legitimacy. But the first point of legitimacy is that you and I ought to obey God all the time. We obey the state because God calls us to obey the state. So there's always this supreme point of appeal that we have with our conscience back to God. And with the recognition that I must always obey God, that's sort of the defining place of the nature of when you make your contest, especially with government, and how you pursue that. So in the case of abuse of government, let me just illustrate a couple things, okay? It's easy for government to be very abusive. Since I'll get back to the account of the homeschool program in a minute, but since we've secured the basic liberties to homeschool in Maryland, we've had families in our school that frequently have been abused by local county jurisdictions, and it's happened, I say frequently, I guess in the 23-year history, it's happened multiple times, so that's frequent, but it's actually not that frequent, from month to month, from week to week. But in every case, what always happens is a new, young, aggressive member of the local Board of Education who's responsible for enforcing regulations on homeschooling, their zeal without knowledge kicks them into gear, and they begin applying what they believe to be the law in the fashion in which they believe it. And the most startling and amazing thing is, very often they don't have a clue what it says. Probably the most enjoyable interaction I had was one year, probably about 1989 or 1990, somewhere in that vicinity. One year I got an angry call from the brand new superintendent of Montgomery County Public Schools. It was a woman, and she was absolutely furious. She was accusing me of every wrong that you could muster and calling me by every degrading name in the book she could call me by. And the problem was she had demanded something and I didn't comply because she was demanding something the law didn't require. So in her anger, she calls me on the phone to basically bring me under the emotional threat that she was going to punish me if I didn't cooperate. And on that phone, I had already had multiple cases of talking to new employees for a county saying, well, have you read the regulation? Do you know what the regulation says? And going through the process and then saying, well, what's your concern? Well, here's what the regulation says. And so I was familiar with that, so I just went through that little ritual with her and I said, well, what's your concern? Have you read the regulation? What regulation? Well, you know, I cited it. Well, yeah, I read it. Well, did you read section 5, point B? Section 5, point B, what does that say? And I had it in front of me, read it to her. And it was just an amazing thing that she just sort of, okay. And before I finished the phone call, a correction had been made. But see, here's the point. We must be ready to engage at that point of hostile contact in a proper fashion, or we'll have our rights abused. Now, in the cases that we've had with the superintendent or all these other county officials, I don't know of one case yet where somebody was deliberately trying to take away rights. I don't know of one case. Every single case was a legitimate attempt for a government official to fulfill what they believed to be the mandate of the responsibilities given to them in regulation and law. And the problem that existed was not that they were abusing their authority, they were simply ignorant of the total nature of the law. But here's the amazing thing. So some of these counties, for example, the law says if you're going to be homeschooled, then there needs to be at least 2 visits a year with a supervising agent, either a private agent like Walkersville, or the local county Board of Education will provide a supervisor to review the work. A new supervisor is assigned in a county, Harford County. The new supervisor looks at their list and calls every single list and wants to do a home visit with every single person on the list. Totally disregarding, not because they're trying to disregard it, but because they're just simply ignorant of the fact that there's 2 groups of homeschoolers, one group they oversee, the other group they don't. But here's the amazing thing. I had families in that district allow the people personnel workers showed up at the doorstep, knocked on the door, said, I demand to come in and do a home visit. But they didn't make a call ahead of time. They just showed up. It was a hostile, threatening occasion. And what did my parents do? Well, we have clear rules in our guidelines. Close the door and call me. They didn't close the door and call me. They opened the door, invited in, and did a home visit. And I talked to the mother later. I said, why did you open the door and let him in? And this was the answer. Well, we're Christians, and we're supposed to obey the government. And they demanded to come in, and I needed to obey them. And it was like, I don't think you get it. God tells us to obey our government. But our government is clearly constructed so that citizens can always contest the government's claims when the 2 rights seem to encroach upon each other. We don't just roll over and play dead because we're afraid of the government, but that's where many, many, many Christians are. That's where, we want to obey the government, we want to be seen as cooperative, and so we misunderstand that entering into the arena of contest is how believers influence their government for good. You must enter your government in order to influence it. Interesting picture. Our original contest with the state was not going well for us. Basically, this was what the department had decided. Walkersville is too little. We don't have to worry about them. We can disregard their rights because they're so small they have no resource. And when they're looking at resource, they realize we couldn't mount a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and come after them and wear them out. So we had no, we had bearing inside of the law, but emotionally We had no status in the sight of the government. Well, this is a little puny guy, and if this guy does it, every little puny worm's going to try to do the same thing, so let's stomp him out, let's stop him. So I didn't really get very far. We began to prepare for a lawsuit because that's your next step. Now, again, we have 3 branches of government locally, on the state level and on the national level, but we're dealing with the state level. I'm told by another pastor, Christian school superintendent or whatever, well, when you need help, there's some legislators that will help you. So I realized, okay, well, the legislator has influence. Now, at the time, I didn't really understand how or why the legislature had influence, but I knew that was a place of appeal. The 3 branches of government give you an arena for communication and resolving problems. We're not just subject to one ignorant implementation of the law by a misinformed government official hired at the lowest level of the government. We're not bound by that. We have the need to know the law, and then we're obligated to assert our rights. Obviously with respect, obviously within the bounds of legality. But that's participation. Asserting your rights within the bounds of legality is the very nature of participation in government, and it's critically important. Well, we were being denied rights, not because we were legally in error, but because the board was afraid of abuse of the law, and they wouldn't know how to control the abuse, so they just abridged our rights to make it easier on them. And I'm sure they were prepared to go to court if necessary to demonstrate to a judge, well, we had to abridge their rights because our interest was greater than theirs, and so unfortunately their rights have to be abridged so that the larger rights of the state are secured. But when I went to the delegate in Annapolis, I was given the name of a particular delegate. I didn't know who he was or why he was important. I was just told he was favorable and could help. I went and sat to the delegate. Well, when I sat down, what I didn't know was before I got there, the Board of Education, the superintendent, had already called this delegate and had already poisoned him against me. And so when I showed up, they were imagining that I probably would show up. And when I arrived, I didn't get a very warm reception. So I'm sitting there, and the secretary's real hostile to me, and she starts asking what I would call more mean-spirited questions, antagonistic to homeschooling, antagonistic to our cause. And the Lord gave me courage, and I just answered her antagonistic questions with positive, appropriate answers based on the truth, based on what was really taking place. Because one of the things that's true about an antagonistic situation is usually the antagonist, if they don't actually have facts, they're in a bad position because they have simply prejudices. Well, facts many times win over prejudice, especially when you have these competing forms of government. So this particular prejudice of the Board of Education had filtered down to this particular delegate, and his secretary was substantially hostile to me. But I answered her questions, and as time wore on, one of the things that I mentioned earlier about the nature of influence in government, the Christian's influence always stems from his zeal, his desire to honor the Lord. And so he's always an example of a right justice system, someone who's under authority because they're ready to obey God. So when I gave my answers to all these hostile questions, there was one point in the discussion that I was totally shocked because the lady stopped asking hostile questions and turned to me and said, "How can you be born again?" I was like astonished, like, where did that question come from? And so I sensed by her manner that it was a genuine question. She had gotten off the high horse and had drawn into some personal need. And I explained, and we spent the rest of the time waiting for the delegate, talking about the needs of her family, the nature of the gospel, and what it means to be born again. And I was somewhat astonished. Now, when the delegate finally arrived, though, I guess you could say I had poisoned the secretary in my favor, because now she was no longer holding the prejudice that she held prior to my arrival, and I was ushered in with some grace by the secretary, and I sat down with the delegate. But he tipped his hand, and this is what he said at the beginning of our meeting. He said, "I want you to know the superintendent has already called me. I've heard his side of the story, and I agree with him. So I'm not going to be able to help you today, but what's your story?" Of course, that's a little disheartening to think that the audience you're going to get has already decided against your case before they've heard the information. And so I was a little bit at a loss, and I didn't know this gentleman from anyone else in terms of who he was or why the superintendent would call him. I found out later he was the key person on the subcommittee governing the superintendent's budget, and he alone could smash the superintendent's budget to nothing. And so the superintendent, that was the only guy he was worried of. If I got to him, he could get in trouble. So he wanted to disassociate trouble from the situation. So there I am in a prejudiced environment. Now, here's the beauty of being a Christian and knowing what it means to make an appeal for the sake of legitimate, righteous causes and understanding what the law is. He said, I can't help you. What's your story? And at that moment, the Lord sort of gave me a sense of intuitive direction. I realized that the three divisions of government were there for protecting people like me from abuse, like I was feeling I was getting. So I made an appeal to his highest level of authority. I said, well, I just want to explain to you that I'm a citizen keeping the laws which you wrote, and the state is trying to prevent me from it. I stated my case in those simple terms. He said, well, how's that? And then I did something kind of, you can only do this if you've done your homework and you're knowledgeable. I said, right behind you on your shelf is the education code. Would you get that off the shelf? He reached behind him. Now these delegates don't know anything about the law. It's just, unless they've been saturated in some issue, they don't know the details. There's too much to know. So I said, get the book off. I said, now open it to section 7-301. And without me looking at it, I told him what it said and explained the parameter. I said, now turn to 2-206 and read that and explain them. Now, here's what we've done. We've kept the law. And the state is trying to tell us that we're not allowed to do that. And he looked at me and he said with great emotion, well, they can't do that to you. And I had not only won the factual case, I had won the emotional case. I now had this guy in my pocket. Right at that moment, the superintendent of Maryland schools called that delegate, worried that I was going to show up. Took the call in front of me, and I listened to him say to the superintendent, oh yeah, he's right here in front of me right now. Which I later learned who it was. And he said, yeah, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Superintendent, but I'm not going to be able to be with you on this one. I am going to side with Mr. Cox, and we're going to protect his interests. And at that moment, homeschooling became legal in Maryland. Because that single delegate holding power over the purse of the Department of Education had influence. That's checks and balances. That's for fairness. That delegate created and mandated a meeting between me and the board, and I met with the superintendent the next week in his room, and he's looking at the Walkersville program, and this is what he says. He says, even faced, without any emotion, he says, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. You want to know the truth? Your program is so well organized, we could never do anything this well as you are. There's just no reason for us to resist you. So with that, the eventual happening was they took our structure from our program and they drew up a regulation, and now every church in Maryland can homeschool if they could copy Walkersville. They have to do it like we do it. That was how that influence came. But see, in that whole process, it wasn't so smooth sailing. There was one time when I was feeling threatened, I blew it. I had the guy in charge of shutting down private schools if they don't keep the law. I had him on the phone. His name was Dr. Spain. Had him on the phone, and he was saying, well, we've decided you can't do it, so you'll have to close down, sorry. And I said, I'm sorry, you don't have the authority. You don't own the kids. I said, if the state wants to exert this kind of authority over children, let them go have their own babies. But those of us who have our own babies, you keep your hands off of us. And he was like, and I wasn't real pleasant the way I said it. I mean, it was kind of rude. He kind of retaliated and said, doesn't it say in Romans 13 to obey the government? I'd say, what a convenient one-liner, I say, yeah, I obey government, but this is illegitimate government. You're stepping out of bounds. You don't have authority to just go all over the place. But the reality is, when you're small and your rights are infringed, you're capable of surrendering your rights just to pure threat, just to sheer an inappropriate extension of government. Now, some governments will do that on purpose. But like I mentioned, most of what I've run into in my experience has not been purposeful abuse, it's been ignorant abuse. But it's still nonetheless abuse. But that's the whole essence of participating in government. You participate in the process of appeal. Now what we were doing, we were preparing a legal case on the one hand, but on the other hand, we were making private appeals to people that had potential influence over other departments of education, and that's actually how the Lord turned things around in Maryland. We never ended up in a court. We never had a legal precedent established for our program, but we did end up having our program not only legitimatized, but it was actually codified, which means the structure of our program was put into regulation so that what we already are doing is acceptable and accepted by the state for overseeing homeschooling. So that's part of this whole nature of encouragement. You know, what are the kinds of things that you and I have responsibility for? I want to tell you that you don't do those kind of things if your mentality is simply libertine pleasures. That's, you know, you very seldom move into an area of substantive influence in government when all you're after is your own personal pleasure. Because what always moves us is to compete in an arena of injustice. You have to be willing to surrender something that you hold dear because there's a higher value, a higher authority, an obligation of duty that surpasses this lower level obligation that is put before you. And I had resolved that this way in my own heart. I said, you know, I have to be willing to have the state take my kids from me for doing what's right in the Lord's eyes. I have to, that's the only place that I can be, because I'm not willing to just take my preferences and risk anything for that. I need to risk my integrity before the Lord. And so it was in that window of integrity, what are you willing to die for? And that's why when we talked about conscience in a couple lectures ago, I basically said in the last panel of that lecture was, if you don't have something that you'll die for, then you don't have anything that you'll live for. And the whole process of using your liberties and using your rights that are guaranteed for you by the Constitution is that you have to have something worth living for that has substance and value by which it'll draw you into that arena to take care of your interests. Now, what I look at the time here, I actually don't have a whole lot more time here to cover. I've got several things I want to point here. First of all, let me quote Luke 12:11 here to you. Jesus was speaking to his disciples concerning potential persecution, and he said, when they bring you into the synagogues and unto the magistrates and unto the powers, take you no thought how or what things you shall answer, what you shall say, for the Holy Ghost shall teach you at the same hour what you ought to say. And that's an important picture of what Jesus Christ anticipated his people would be involved in. This little verse indicates one thing paramountly, that the nature of the gospel is such that to a believer who's fully pursuing God on a right plane, that believer will resist the government when necessary to the point of their own harm. They'll risk their own safety and well-being in order to stand up for the simplicity and the righteousness and the truth of the gospel. And in that place where they're willing to risk their very life for conscience sake towards God, that is the place of the greatest and the largest influence in the history of man. And so God gave his believers the most powerful weapon for influence that there is. And this little adage here about saying, don't plan on what you have to say, I've actually been in enough situations where there's a little bit of clarity to what that is. There was an aspect to which I did have to have a reason for the hope that lie within me. Peter says that in 1 Peter 3. Be able to give the reason for the hope that lies within you and do it with meekness and fear. So when I organized the homeschool program, I did it legitimately, out of right reasons, out of right purpose. I organized things in a way that would be appropriate. So I had reasonableness attached to what I was doing. However, when I sat before John Gary, I had no idea what I was going to say. All I know is going to meet with somebody. I didn't even know who he was. And at that moment that I was meeting with him, I didn't have a clue, but the Holy Spirit is the one that prompted me to say, could you get the law book off the shelf behind you? And he allowed me to honor him by saying, you guys wrote this. This is your law, and I'm keeping your law. Now, that's my fault, that's my error. Well, that was what the Holy Spirit gave me at that hour, and it became influential at that moment. And so that's the picture. You don't really know how things are going to play out, but you do need to know where you stand. Here, Luther said, "Here I stand." I can say no other. And so, the believer has such potential for influence when his concerns legitimately spring from his desire to obey God and to pursue those interests. I have so many little stories to share that I was hoping to give a few. I didn't think it would take so long to just share one story. But let me look through the list here and see if there's another one worthy of sharing here. Well, maybe I'll just go with the next level. There's so many things I can share. Years later, we had a controversy. When the department approved Walkersville, they did so on paper. They created a legal document that credentialed our program. However, what they did was, behind the scenes, they made an agreement that basically said, we will not allow anybody else to do this. Walkersville, actually there was Walkersville and Valley Brook got in at the same time because they were organized similar to us. Walkersville and Valley Brook, that's it. No other churches can do this program, period. Well, as time went on, I started getting phone calls from pastors. And a pastor would call me and say, well, I was talking to the Board of Education for the Next Step Homeschool program, and the Board of Education said to see you because in order to do a program, you have to be like you. So what did you do? So we started becoming a state agent, I guess, telling people how to organize their homeschool programs. But what the state was really doing was refusing to give information. And basically they were posturing themselves. If anybody came in well organized like me, they would let them pass. But anybody that didn't come in well organized, they would just say, sorry, it's not what you have. So they didn't have a regulation, but they had a means of dismissing. And they were planning on dismissing everyone. So it began to be an occasion of conflict and controversy. And one pastor in his church went to the department, brought an attorney, and the Attorney General who was operating for the department at that time was there, and stubbornly said, no, you can't do this, we're not going to allow it, it's not going to happen. And things got tense, threats were made, and this Attorney General got really resistant and then just turned on everyone and said, all right, nobody can do it. And I got a phone call the next day from the department saying, Walkersville's been shut down, you can't do this program anymore. And I'm like, since when do you shut someone down without even letting him hear what you're talking about? So I was talking to the assistant superintendent to the public schools, and she said, well, it's the Attorney General, she's upset and she's not going to back down, it's just the way it is. And I said, well, don't you think it would be appropriate then for me to at least speak to this Attorney General? Well, in terms of human endeavors, I felt like I should have been allowed at that meeting because I could have lent some history with the new Attorney General. I could have helped out. I didn't get invited, and I felt like, maybe I missed an opportunity. Well, what God knew, what he was doing is that meeting wasn't going to turn out well. If I had been at that meeting, I would have nothing else to say. The point of appeal would have been lost. But since I had not been there, the department was able to say, well, Attorney General, you must meet with Mr. Cox to hear his concerns. And so as I was getting ready to meet with that Attorney General, I read the letter that she wrote to the, not the letter, but the ruling that she wrote to the board. And I realized that, most of what she said was clear, good study. She had taken it out of the context of the past history, and I only disagreed with one little point. And I felt kind of relieved. Well, this is a reasonable attorney doing a reasonable job. But what I didn't know was what her need was. Everybody was calling her unreasonable. So when she called me to make the appointment, she was furious. She was so angry. And I said, thank you for being willing to meet with me. She said, don't thank me. I have no interest in meeting with you. I am being commanded to by my superior, so I'm in obedience, but I have no interest in talking to you. I will give you 1 hour, and I have no interest in hearing what you have to say, but bring it on. You have 1 hour to do it. I thought, well, she's hot. So I got my briefcases full as I could with everything could potentially relate to the matter, and I read her document and had this sense of she really was reasonable. Well, when I got up that morning, I'm driving to the board, and I'm intellectually recognizing you're going to your execution. Now, this is the day your head's rolling. But in my spirit, I was so full of vision for our school and the things that God was orchestrating to do, and just a zeal was eating me up of all the fun, exciting things that we're doing in homeschooling. And I thought, this is really strange. Why is my emotion so different from my condition? Most people fear their death. You know, I'm just like, I can't relate it to it. But that was just part of the work of the Holy Spirit in my heart, because what I needed was that relief from sometimes tension. I couldn't go into that room tense, and the Lord knew it. I didn't know it. That was just the work of the Holy Spirit. So when we get in there, I make a few comments about some visionary thing the school board had up. I said, you know, we're doing some similar things, and I just chit-chatted about some of our program ideals. And I had no idea that went deep into her, but because she was still angry. Her face was so hard. She was so furious. She started, okay, you got 1 hour, get going. What do you want to say? So I thought, well, she still is bad. But the first thing I said was, you know, well, the first thing I want to say is I just really appreciate this document you wrote. You know, it's apparent that you studied well, that you really know the topic, and I agree with everything you say in there except one little tiny thing. And with that, it was almost like I hit her in the back with a club, and she kind of leaned forward to me and said, what? You appreciate what I wrote? You're the only one. She almost burst into tears. She started reciting everybody in the department. You know, these Christian pastors, these Christian lawyers, everybody was reading her the Riot Act and calling her all kinds of names, calling her the biggest criminal since Hitler and all, you know. She was emotionally under such siege. And just the little kindness of acknowledgement, she did a good job. She said, well, what's the little thing that you don't agree with? And I said, well, it's just that when I met with the other Attorney General, we resolved it, you know, this is what we agreed to do, you know, and this is how it's going to work. And she took a blank sheet of paper, or actually a blank pen, and said, well, could you help me fix this? And I was there 3 hours, and I dictated the state's policy on how to bring this to pass. and it was a miraculous miracle. The next time I went to the department, I walked into the department, and like everybody just stopped and looked at me like, who are you? How did you influence that attorney? Because she was so mad. And it was one of those little things that only the Lord knows what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. But the point is, people aren't adversaries, but competing interests are adversarial. So we've got to learn to separate our personal feelings, our personal affronts, our personal emotions from engaging in a discussion over the substantive issues that pertain to competing interests of one set of rights versus another set of rights. So probably the most amazing thing that happened out of that meeting with the Attorney General was later that year, I got a phone call from the department real humbly asking me, would I lobby for them at the legislature? I said, you want me to lobby for you? What do I have to offer? They said, well, when you visited with the Attorney General, you explained your program, and she was really impressed with some of the vision for it, and the state wants to do some of that, and the legislature is really angry at us and doesn't want us to do it. And we thought, well, maybe if you, who have favor with these legislators, could present just what you're doing and explain how you're doing it, maybe they won't be so offended that we want to do it. So it was just an amazing picture of moving into relationship and interaction and influence because we're pursuing issues and resolving questions of issues, and we're backing away from. Probably the number one mistake that Christians make is to personally become adversarial against government, calling government the Antichrist, and their response to government absolutely refusing to let Antichrist have anything to do with them. And so it's missing the point, missing the mark of what government is all about. Well, I have other stories, but I'm not capable of sharing them in the time that I have left. I do have a couple more minutes, and I wanted to make a couple comments here about influence. I've read a couple articles recently, and what I would like to suggest is, still at this very hour, the most important need in the Christian world, in the secular world, is for Christians to pay attention to what are the real, substantive, significant core issues of the values of humanity as is embodied by God's standard. There's never been any form of religion anywhere in the history of man that comes near to the true religion of God, that starts with the premise that God created man, so that all authority goes back to God, number one, and number two, that God created man in his own image, so that God has the highest possible purpose and value granted to man, so that the pursuit of a believer concerning God's interest in humanity, if we truly pursue God's interest, we will never fail to pursue the highest purpose and the highest ideal that God has for man, no matter what the nature of the government system is or what the matter of responsible resolution amounts to. Believers can and must make presentation of those in society. But here's the problem, and I just want to get to this one point. Do you know what the number one problem is for influence of believers? It's fear. Do you know what the number one advantage or the number one weapon that Satan has to control man, to control believers? It's fear. Satan always uses fear. He threatens, he gets right in your face and screams at you so that there's this fear that if I do this, I'm going to lose something that's much more valuable. And you get to that place where, without really calculating, without really understanding, we back away from contesting inappropriate extensions of government, inappropriate contests between men. We back away from entering into those discussions for fear that if it turns against me, I'm going to lose more than what I have. And you and I need to recognize that while certainly we don't enter into every fray, and we certainly don't enter into frays that are merely there to provide our own prurient interest that we have. For example, probably a waste of time in most, as I can perceive it, I guess I'll leave it there. Probably a waste of time for a believer to get all hyped up about motorcycle helmet laws, as if that's really a critical, pivotal issue of society. That probably isn't where you need to spend your time. But it is important to recognize that the believer above every other person on the earth is the one who's called to preach justice, to give that hope of that justice to the poor, and to suffer even the loss of your own personal asset and well-being for the sake of securing for another sacred rights and interests granted to them by God.